Dearest listeners, there exists in the annals of matrimonial history no creature quite so formidable as a widowed duchess who believes her son too precious for any mortal woman. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most heart-rending tale of a bride left to suffer in silence, a child lost in solitude, and a marriage that required nothing short of devastation to be reborn from its ashes. What unfolds is a chronicle of abandonment so cruel, betrayal so calculated, and redemption so hard-won that you shall find yourself questioning whether some sins can ever truly be forgiven. If you wish to hear more tales of hearts tested by the cruelties of our society, do grant this chronicler the favor of your like and subscription. And I confess, your thoughts in the comments below would be most welcome, for this particular history tends to divide even the wisest of observers. Now, settle yourself comfortably, for what lies ahead is not a tale for the faint of heart, but rather a stark reminder that the most gilded of cages can conceal the darkest of sorrows. Lady Emmeline Crowe understood from her earliest years that beauty without fortune was a double-edged sword in the marriage mart of Regency England. At 21, she possessed the kind of loveliness that caused seasoned rakes to lose their composure and proper matrons to purse their lips in disapproval. Fair hair that gleamed like spun gold in candlelight, eyes the color of spring violets, and a countenance so delicate that portrait painters despaired of capturing its essence. Yet for all this natural endowment, she remained painfully aware that her father's barony carried no weight in the ledgers that truly mattered to the ton. The late Baron Crowe had been a gentleman of impeccable lineage but catastrophic judgment when it came to matters of commerce and investment. He had departed this mortal realm 3 years prior, leaving behind nothing but debts, a crumbling manor house in Hertfordshire, and 2 daughters whose prospects diminished with each passing season. Emmeline's elder sister Margaret had married a respectable country squire the previous year, a match born of pragmatism rather than passion, leaving Emmeline as the sole remaining hope for salvaging what little remained of the family name. Their mother, the Dowager Lady Crowe, had taken refuge with her sister in Bath, unable to bear the shame of their reduced circumstances. Thus, Emmeline found herself residing with Margaret and her husband, a well-meaning gentleman farmer whose conversation rarely strayed beyond crop rotations and livestock breeding. She spent her days reading whatever volumes she could borrow from the local circulating library, walking through meadows that held no claim to fashionable beauty, and wondering if she would spend her remaining years as an unpaid governess to her sister's future children. It was during the autumn of 1814 that fortune, capricious as ever, elected to intervene. A distant cousin on her mother's side, Lady Thornbury, wrote to express her intention of sponsoring Emmeline for the upcoming London season. The lady's motives were transparent enough. She had recently lost her own daughter to scarlet fever and sought to channel her maternal energies towards some worthy charitable object. Emmeline bristled at being regarded as an object of pity, yet she possessed sufficient sense to recognize that pride was a luxury she could ill afford. And so, in the spring of 1815, as London prepared to celebrate Wellington's triumph over Bonaparte at Waterloo, Emmeline found herself thrust into the glittering world of Mayfair drawing rooms, Almack's assembly rooms, and the fashionable promenade of Hyde Park during the prescribed hour when all persons of consequence displayed themselves to society's scrutiny. Lady Thornbury, a woman of considerable consequence despite her personal sorrows, proved an adequate if emotionally distant sponsor, ensuring that Emmeline received invitations to all the proper events whilst maintaining a careful distance that prevented any undue attachment. Emmeline approached the marriage mart with clear-eyed pragmatism. She knew herself to be beautiful, reasonably accomplished in the arts expected of young ladies, and possessed of manners refined enough to avoid giving offense. She also knew that her lack of dowry meant she must aim for either a very young son, desperate for beauty over fortune, a widower seeking a mother for his children, or perhaps, if fortune truly smiled, a wealthy cit eager to purchase entree into society through marriage to impoverished gentility. What she had not anticipated was the Duke of Keswick. Piers Fitzroy, The ninth Duke of Keswick was 9 and 20 years of age and represented everything that sensible young ladies were taught to regard as the pinnacle of matrimonial achievement. His title stretched back to the Norman Conquest. His estates encompassed vast tracts of Derbyshire, Yorkshire, and Kent, and his annual income exceeded £30,000, a sum so substantial that even the most mercenary of mamas could scarce comprehend it. He possessed a devastating handsomeness that was spoken of throughout the ton, with raven hair, slate-gray eyes, and a countenance that suggested both intelligence and a certain melancholy. He was also, as Emmeline would later discover, entirely dominated by his mother. The Dowager Duchess of Keswick, born Lady Arabella Montford, daughter of a marquis, had been widowed when Piers was merely 16 years of age. The late Duke had expired quite suddenly of an apoplectic fit whilst arguing with his steward over the price of sheep, leaving his wife to guide their only son through the treacherous waters of inheritance, responsibility, and power. Lady Arabella had approached this duty with the fervor of a general marshalling troops for battle. She had overseen every aspect of her son's education, personally vetted his companions, and made it abundantly clear that no young woman in all of England could possibly be worthy of becoming the next Duchess of Keswick. For 13 years, she had successfully deflected every maternal plot, discouraged every flirtation, and maintained her position as the undisputed mistress of Keswick House in Grosvenor Square, Thornfield Abbey in Derbyshire, and the 4 other significant properties that comprised the ducal holdings. She had grown comfortable in her queenly role, had cultivated an extensive circle of admirers who valued her wit and feared her sharp tongue, and had convinced herself that she had arranged matters to her complete satisfaction. She had not accounted for the possibility that her son might one day look upon a penniless baron's daughter and feel his carefully controlled heart begin to surrender. The meeting occurred at Lady Devereux's ball in late May, an event that attracted the cream of London society and a fair number of social climbers hoping to brush against greatness. Emmeline attended in the company of Lady Thornbury, wearing a gown of white muslin trimmed with seed pearls, the only truly elegant garment she possessed, having been altered from one of her sponsor's late daughter's frocks. The ballroom itself was a crush of humanity, the air thick with the mingled scents of beeswax candles, rice powder, and wilting hothouse flowers tucked into bodices and buttonholes. The heat generated by hundreds of bodies and countless flames created an almost suffocating atmosphere, whilst the shrill sound of the orchestra's violins competed with the constant hum of conversation that rose and fell like waves against a shore. She had learned to hold her head high despite the whispers that followed her, to smile pleasantly at young gentlemen whose interest evaporated once they learned of her financial situation, and to dance with the elderly widowers and younger sons who comprised the bulk of her partners. She had just completed a country dance with a pleasant but dull second son of a viscount when she noticed a commotion near the entrance to the ballroom. The crowds parted with the precision of the Red Sea before Moses as a tall figure entered, accompanied by an elegantly dressed woman whose bearing suggested she regarded everyone present as infinitely beneath her notice. Emmeline observed Lady Thornbury's expression transform from polite interest to something approaching awe, and heard her sponsor murmur that the Duke of Keswick had arrived and that he had brought his formidable mother. Emmeline's first thought upon seeing Piers Fitzroy was that the poets had not exaggerated when they described the physical effect of great masculine beauty upon the female constitution. Her second thought was that the cold, distant expression he wore suggested a man who found the entire enterprise of social gatherings intensely wearisome. He moved through the room with the grace of a predator who knew himself to be at the top of the natural hierarchy, accepting greetings with minimal warmth, dancing with precisely those young ladies whose rank made refusal impossible, and maintaining an air of such profound ennui that half the debutantes in the room fell immediately and hopelessly in love with him. The Dowager Duchess, by contrast, moved through the assembly with the energy of a woman half her age, her sharp eyes cataloguing every detail, her conversation calculated to charm those who mattered and dismiss those who did not. She wore purple silk, expensive enough to border on vulgarity, adorned with amethysts that proclaimed her wealth with all the subtlety of a town crier. Her handsome face, still beautiful despite her 50 years, wore an expression of perpetual assessment, as though she were a magistrate weighing evidence in a particularly tedious trial. Emmeline had no expectation of being introduced to such elevated personages. Young ladies of her station might glimpse dukes from across crowded rooms, but rarely presumed to approach their orbit. She had resigned herself to observing the Duke of Keswick from a safe distance when fate, in the form of Lady Thornbury's determination to prove her own consequence, intervened. Lady Thornbury had enjoyed a brief friendship with the Dowager Duchess some 20 years prior, before the latter's elevation to ducal status had rendered such friendships between those of differing rank unnecessary. Now, seized by either sentiment or ambition, she led Emmeline directly toward the formidable woman and performed what could only be described as an aggressive introduction. The Dowager Duchess received them with glacial politeness, her eyes passing over Emmeline with the interest one might accord a moderately well-executed piece of needlework, worthy of a brief glance but nothing more. She responded to Lady Thornbury's pleasantries with the minimum courtesy required, clearly preparing to dismiss them both with elegant efficiency when something entirely unexpected occurred. The Duke of Keswick, who had been standing beside his mother in an attitude of profound boredom, suddenly looked at Emmeline with an expression that could only be described as arrested attention. His grey eyes, which had appeared so cold and disinterested mere moments before, now focused upon her face with an intensity that caused her breath to catch in her throat. For a long moment, neither spoke, and the silence stretched between them like a taut violin string awaiting the bow. It was the Dowager Duchess who broke the spell, her voice sharp with displeasure, as she reminded her son of his obligation to dance with Miss Honoria Talbot Grey, daughter of the Earl of Rutherford and possessor of £40,000. Piers blinked as though awakening from a trance and dutifully excused himself to fulfill his maternal directive. Yet as he walked away, he glanced back at Emmeline with such naked longing that several observers noted it with interest. Lady Thornbury, sensing an opportunity that exceeded her wildest expectations, began to chatter about Emmeline's accomplishments with the enthusiasm of a horse trader at Tattersall's. The Dowager Duchess listened with barely concealed impatience, her responses growing shorter and colder with each passing moment, until she finally excused herself with such finality that even Lady Thornbury's determination could not overcome it. Emmeline found herself trembling as they retreated to the refreshment room. She told herself that her reaction was merely the natural consequence of being noticed by a duke, that any young woman would feel similarly affected, that she must not allow herself to indulge in romantic fantasies about a gentleman so far above her station. Yet even as she rehearsed these sensible arguments, she could not banish the memory of those grey eyes looking at her as though she were the only woman in the entire crowded ballroom. As Providence would have it, the evening was far from concluded. Emmeline had retreated to the terrace for air, accompanied by a maternal acquaintance of Lady Thornbury, who served as adequate chaperonage whilst being sufficiently deaf to pose no conversational burden. The older woman settled herself on a bench and promptly dozed off, leaving Emmeline to contemplate the torches illuminating Lady Devereux's gardens and to wonder if she had imagined the Duke's expression of interest. She had not imagined it. Piers Fitzroy emerged onto the terrace as though summoned by her thoughts, moving with the determined grace of a man who had made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of consequences. He approached Emmeline with none of the languid indifference he had displayed in the ballroom, his eyes alive with an emotion she dared not name, and performed a bow of such perfect correctness that it somehow managed to convey passionate feeling despite its formal precision. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deeper than she had anticipated, with a slight roughness that suggested either nervousness or suppressed emotion. He apologized for the impropriety of approaching her without proper introduction, though they had technically been introduced through Lady Thornbury's offices. He inquired whether she was enjoying the evening, whether she found London to her liking, whether she had visited the exhibitions at Somerset House. His questions were conventional enough, yet the manner in which he asked them, leaning slightly forward, his entire attention focused upon her responses as though they contained the secrets of the universe, transformed banality into intimacy. Emmeline responded with careful correctness, acutely aware of her sleeping chaperone and the impropriety of this encounter despite its surface propriety. She had been raised to understand that dukes did not develop sudden passions for impoverished barons' daughters without ulterior motives, that young women in her position must guard their reputations with vigilance approaching paranoia, and that allowing herself to hope for anything beyond a brief flirtation would be the height of foolishness. Yet when Piers asked whether she would grant him the honor of calling upon her and Lady Thornbury the following afternoon, she found herself agreeing before her better judgment could intervene. He left the terrace shortly thereafter, disappearing back into the ballroom with one final glance that promised everything and nothing. Emmeline stood in the torchlight, her heart racing, her mind whirling with equal parts hope and terror, and wondered whether she had just experienced the most wonderful or most disastrous moment of her life. The Dowager Duchess, watching from a window overlooking the terrace, had observed the entire encounter. Her expression, had anyone been present to witness it, would have frozen the Thames in midsummer. She had spent 13 years carefully curating her son's future, had deflected countless unsuitable girls, had maintained her position through intelligence and ruthless determination. She was not about to surrender it all to a penniless nobody with a pretty face and presumptuous ambitions. The war, though neither side yet recognized it as such, had begun. Piers Fitzroy called upon Emmeline the following afternoon at precisely the fashionable hour of 4 o'clock, arriving in a carriage so magnificent that it caused Lady Thornbury's neighbours to crowd their windows for a better view. He brought with him an enormous bouquet of white roses, a gesture that was both romantic and proper, expensive enough to impress, but traditional enough to avoid giving offence. Lady Thornbury received him with barely suppressed glee, recognizing that her sponsored protégé had somehow managed to attract the most eligible bachelor in England. The visit proceeded according to the strict protocols that governed such encounters. Piers sat in the drawing room, balancing a teacup with surprising grace for such a large man, and made conversation that touched upon all the appropriate subjects: the weather, the season's entertainments, mutual acquaintances, while his eyes remained fixed upon Emmeline with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her determination to remain composed. Lady Thornbury, playing her role as chaperone with more enthusiasm than subtlety, steered the conversation toward Emmeline's accomplishments. She mentioned her protégé's skill at watercolors, her pleasant singing voice, her fluency in French and Italian, her extensive reading. Each revelation caused Piers to lean forward with greater interest, asking questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness. When Emmeline mentioned her particular fondness for Gothic novels, he admitted to sharing this supposedly frivolous taste, and they spent 20 minutes discussing the relative merits of various horrid tales, whilst Lady Thornbury looked on in bewildered satisfaction. The visit extended well beyond the prescribed 15 minutes, stretching to nearly an hour before Piers reluctantly took his leave. As he departed, he secured permission to call again, to accompany them to the opera, to join their party for a promenade in Hyde Park. Lady Thornbury granted these requests with an alacrity that bordered on desperation, already envisioning her triumph as the sponsor who had secured a ducal match for her impoverished protégé. What none of them could have known was that the Dowager Duchess had spent the morning making calls of her own, carefully poisoning the well of public opinion against Emmeline with such subtle skill that her victims barely recognized the venom being administered. She mentioned in the drawing rooms of her most influential friends that her son seemed momentarily distracted by a young person of no particular consequence, that she had every confidence he would soon recover his senses, that the girl in question possessed nothing but a pretty face and presumptuous ambitions. She expressed sympathy for Lady Thornbury's misguided charity in sponsoring such an obvious fortune hunter, lamented the tendency of impoverished gentility to angle for husbands so far above their station, and planted seeds of doubt with such delicacy that her listeners never suspected they were being manipulated into serving as her mouthpieces. The whispers began almost immediately. By the following evening, when Piers escorted Emmeline and Lady Thornbury to the King's Theatre for a performance of Handel's Giulio Cesare, half the ton was watching their box with avid interest. The other half was already spreading rumors about the penniless Miss Crowe, who had somehow managed to entrap the Duke of Keswick, about her calculating nature, about her sponsor's barely concealed mercenary ambitions. The fact that Emmeline conducted herself with perfect propriety, that she appeared more overwhelmed than triumphant, that Piers seemed genuinely entranced rather than reluctantly duty-bound, none of these observations penetrated the thick wall of gossip that the Dowager Duchess had erected with such ruthless efficiency. Emmeline became aware of the hostile attention gradually, noticing the pointed stares, the whispered conversations that ceased when she approached, the sudden coolness of young ladies who had previously treated her with neutral politeness. Lady Thornbury, too absorbed in her own triumph to recognize the gathering storm, remained oblivious to the subtle signs of social warfare. Only Piers, whose position insulated him from the worst of the gossip, continued to court Emmeline with increasing devotion, seemingly unaware that his mother was orchestrating a campaign to destroy the young woman who had captured his heart. The courtship progressed with the stately inevitability of a ship sailing toward a hurricane. Piers called daily, accompanied Emmeline to exhibitions and concerts, sent her books he thought she would enjoy. He revealed himself to be far more than the cold, distant figure he presented to society, possessed of a dry wit, extensive learning, and a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his imposing physical presence. He spoke to her as an equal, solicited her opinions on matters of genuine substance, and listened to her responses with an attention that made her feel, for the first time in her life, truly valued. Emmeline, despite her determination to guard her heart, found herself falling helplessly in love with a man she knew she could never truly have. She tried to maintain emotional distance, to remind herself that dukes did not marry penniless nobodies regardless of mutual affection, that his mother would never permit such a misalliance. Yet when Piers looked at her with those gray eyes full of longing, when he quoted poetry that echoed her own unspoken feelings, when he touched her hand during a dance, and she felt a shock of warmth radiate from that single point of contact through her entire body, all her sensible resolutions crumbled into dust. The Dowager Duchess, observing her son's increasing attachment with mounting alarm, intensified her campaign. She began to speak more openly of her concerns, mentioning to carefully selected friends that she feared Miss Crowe had employed some species of manipulation to ensnare her innocent son. She hinted at a background less respectable than advertised, suggested that Baron Crowe's financial troubles had darker origins than mere poor judgment, and implied that Emmeline possessed both the means and motive to entrap a wealthy husband through any methods necessary. These accusations, delivered with the authority of a duchess and the certainty of maternal concern, gained traction among those inclined to believe the worst. The fact that no evidence supported these claims mattered less than the source from which they emanated. The Dowager Duchess possessed too much influence, had cultivated too many obligations, commanded too much respect for her words to be dismissed as mere prejudice. Yet for all her machinations, she could not prevent what occurred on a mild June evening in the gardens of Vauxhall. Piers had secured a supper box for their party, which included Lady Thornbury, her brother Colonel Thornbury, and a cousin of respectable years who served as additional chaperonage. They had dined on the famous wafer-thin ham and rack punch, had strolled the illuminated walks admiring the lanterns, and had paused to listen to a concert of sacred music when Piers, with the determination of a man who had reached the limit of his endurance, drew Emmeline aside into a more secluded area of the gardens. The setting would have been romantic under other circumstances. Fairy lights strung between trees, the distant strains of music, the warm evening air carrying the scent of roses. Piers stood before Emmeline, his tall frame blocking her from the view of passing strollers, and spoke with an urgency that suggested he had rehearsed these words 1,000 times, yet still feared he would bungle their delivery. He told her that he had never expected to fall in love, that he had resigned himself to making a practical marriage to some suitable lady of rank and fortune, that meeting her had overturned all his carefully ordered plans. He acknowledged the disparity in their positions, admitted that society would judge their match harshly, confessed that his mother would undoubtedly oppose the union with every weapon in her considerable arsenal. Then, with a vulnerability that made Emmeline's heart ache, he asked whether she could possibly consider accepting his hand despite all these obstacles. Emmeline felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at this powerful man humbling himself before her, offering her everything she had never dared dream of possessing. She wanted to say yes immediately, to throw herself into his arms and promise to love him forever. Yet the small, practical voice in her head, the voice that had kept her safe through years of poverty and uncertainty, urged caution. She asked with a tremor in her voice whether he understood what accepting him would mean for her. She would be entering a world where she would never truly belong, where his family and friends would always regard her as an interloper, where she would be perpetually judged and found wanting. Could he truly promise to stand by her against such opposition? Could he vow that he would not come to resent her for the social difficulties their marriage would inevitably create? Piers took her hands in his, heedless of propriety, and swore with a fervor that seemed to emanate from his very soul that he would protect her always, that he would never allow anyone, not even his mother, to make her feel unwelcome or unloved, that she would be not merely his wife, but his partner, his equal, his greatest treasure. How could she refuse such a declaration? She accepted his proposal with tears streaming down her face, and for one perfect moment, standing in the shadowy gardens whilst music drifted on the evening air, they allowed themselves to believe that love could conquer all obstacles. They were both desperately, tragically wrong. The engagement caused a sensation that rippled through London society like a stone dropped into a still pond. Those inclined toward romanticism celebrated the Duke who had chosen love over mercenary calculation. Those of more practical bent expressed shock that such an eligible gentleman had wasted himself on a nobody. And the Dowager Duchess of Keswick expressed nothing at all in public, whilst privately unleashing a fury that would have impressed Napoleon himself. She attempted first to persuade her son to reconsider, cornering him in the library of Keswick House and presenting every argument she could marshal. She spoke of duty, of the expectations attached to his position, of the necessity of securing the succession with a bride of impeccable lineage and substantial fortune. She reminded him of his responsibilities to generations past and future, of the scandal such a misalliance would create, of the damage to the family reputation. When these rational arguments failed to move him, she transitioned to emotional manipulation, weeping that she had devoted her life to his welfare only to be cast aside for a designing fortune hunter, that his father would be ashamed of such a disgraceful choice, that she could not bear to witness the destruction of everything she had worked so hard to preserve. Piers, to his credit, remained unmoved. He informed his mother with unusual firmness that his decision was final, that Emmeline would become his duchess regardless of anyone's objections, and that he expected his mother to treat his future bride with the respect her position would demand. The Dowager Duchess, recognizing that direct opposition had failed, changed tactics with the swiftness of an experienced general. She became outwardly gracious in defeat. She called upon Emmeline and Lady Thornbury, bringing with her a stunning emerald necklace that had belonged to previous duchesses of Keswick, and presenting it to her future daughter-in-law with every appearance of warmth. She offered to assist with wedding preparations, suggested appropriate modistes and milliners, and spoke with apparent enthusiasm about the upcoming nuptials. During one of these visits, whilst discussing the couple's plans following the ceremony, she remarked with what seemed like maternal solicitude that the seclusion of a country estate in autumn was precisely what a new bride required to reflect upon her considerable new duties away from the distractions of London society. The comment, delivered with a gentle smile, sent a faint chill down Lady Thornbury's spine, though she could not articulate precisely why. Emmeline, desperate to believe that her future mother-in-law might accept her after all, allowed herself to be deceived by this performance. Only Lady Thornbury, whose cynicism had been honed by decades of navigating society's treacherous waters, remained suspicious. She warned Emmeline privately that the Dowager Duchess's sudden capitulation seemed altogether too convenient, that women of such formidable will did not surrender so easily, that vigilance would be wise. But Emmeline, intoxicated by love and eager to believe the best of her future family, dismissed these concerns as unworthy suspicion. The wedding took place in July at St. George's, Hanover Square, before a congregation that included half the peerage and twice as many gawkers hoping to witness either a romantic triumph or a spectacular disaster. Emmeline wore a gown of ivory silk so magnificent that it made her previous wardrobe look like servants' cast-offs, her hair dressed with orange blossoms, the Keswick emeralds glowing at her throat like captured starlight. She looked, by all accounts, ethereally beautiful and terrified. Piers stood at the altar in his formal attire, his expression a mixture of pride, love, and determination that would have moved even the most cynical observer. When Emmeline walked down the aisle on Colonel Thornbury's arm, her own father being deceased and her brother-in-law considered too insignificant for such an honor, she saw in her bridegroom's eyes a promise of protection and devotion that made her momentarily forget all her fears. The ceremony proceeded with the traditional solemnity, the vows exchanged in voices that trembled with emotion, the ring placed upon Emmeline's finger with a gentleness that belied Piers's large hands. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, and Piers lifted her veil to bestow the ceremonial kiss, Emmeline felt certain that she stood at the threshold of lasting happiness. She could not have been more mistaken. The wedding breakfast at Keswick House was a lavish affair, featuring delicacies from across the empire and wines that cost more per bottle than Emmeline's family had spent on food for an entire year. The Dowager Duchess presided over the festivities with gracious charm, playing the role of welcoming mother-in-law with such conviction that even Lady Thornbury began to doubt her earlier suspicions. She toasted the happy couple, welcomed Emmeline to the family with apparent sincerity, and expressed her delight at gaining a daughter. Yet beneath this veneer of acceptance, her mind was already calculating the next phase of her campaign. She had lost the battle to prevent the marriage, but the war for control of her son and her position was far from concluded. The first indication of trouble came when Piers announced their plans for the wedding journey. Emmeline had assumed they would travel to Italy or France, as was fashionable among those who could afford such extravagance. Instead, Piers explained with apparent enthusiasm that they would retire to Thornfield Abbey, his principal estate in Derbyshire, where they could enjoy privacy and solitude, away from London's prying eyes. The Dowager Duchess endorsed this plan with suspicious eagerness, mentioning that she herself would remain in London for the remainder of the season, attending to various social obligations. She assured them that she would not dream of intruding upon their honeymoon period, that young couples needed time to establish their marriage without maternal interference, that she would join them at Thornfield in the autumn when the weather turned cold. Emmeline, inexperienced in reading the subtle currents of aristocratic manipulation, heard only the promise of solitude with her new husband, and felt relief rather than suspicion. Piers, who loved his mother despite her flaws and desperately wanted to believe in her apparent acceptance, chose to interpret her cooperation as genuine goodwill rather than strategic positioning. They departed for Derbyshire the following morning, traveling in the ducal carriage with its magnificently matched horses and liveried servants. As they rolled through the countryside toward their new home, Emmeline leaned against her husband's shoulder and allowed herself to believe that all would be well, that love had indeed conquered all obstacles, that the difficulties of her engagement were behind her. She was descending into a trap so perfectly constructed that she would not recognize its bars until they had already closed around her. Thornfield Abbey rose from the Derbyshire hills like a monument to aristocratic power, its grey stone walls and Gothic towers speaking of centuries of Fitzroy dominance over the surrounding countryside. The estate encompassed nearly 10,000 acres of productive farmland, ancient forests, and picturesque villages whose inhabitants had served the ducal family for generations. It was magnificent, imposing, and, as Emmeline would soon discover, profoundly isolating. The first weeks of marriage passed in a haze of happiness that temporarily obscured the gathering shadows. Piers proved an attentive and gentle husband, considerate of her inexperience and determined to ensure her comfort in this new life. They spent their days exploring the estate, riding through forests where autumn leaves created carpets of gold and crimson, walking beside streams that had flowed for millennia. He showed her his favorite childhood haunts, introduced her to tenants who seemed genuinely pleased to meet their new duchess, and spoke with enthusiasm about the future they would build together. In the evenings, they dined in the small family dining room rather than the cavernous formal hall, played cards or chess, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Emmeline felt herself falling ever deeper in love with this complex man who had chosen her despite all opposition, who valued her opinions and laughed at her wit, who made her feel cherished in ways she had never imagined possible. Yet even during this honeymoon period, small incidents began to accumulate like autumn leaves before a storm. Letters from London arrived irregularly, often opened and resealed, with explanations that the seal had been damaged in transit. Invitations to visit neighboring estates somehow failed to reach them, with servants claiming ignorance about their delivery. The household staff, whilst outwardly respectful, maintained a careful distance from their new mistress, looking to the steward and housekeeper for guidance rather than accepting Emmeline's tentative attempts at authority. She mentioned these peculiarities to Piers, who dismissed them as the natural inefficiencies of a large estate or the expected awkwardness of servants adjusting to new management. He assured her that she would establish her authority gradually, that these matters required patience rather than confrontation. Emmeline, inexperienced in managing such an establishment and eager to avoid conflict, accepted his explanations and tried to focus on the positive aspects of her new life. Then, in late September, everything changed. A letter arrived from London, one that somehow escaped whatever screening process had been filtering their correspondence. The Dowager Duchess wrote to her son expressing concern about various matters requiring his immediate attention, mentioning legal documents that needed signing, estate business that could not wait, and political affairs demanding his presence. She wrote with such careful manipulation that Piers felt compelled to return to London despite his reluctance to leave his bride during their honeymoon period. Emmeline, already several weeks pregnant, though not yet certain of her condition, assured him that she would be perfectly content at Thornfield during his absence. She had books to read, sketches to complete, estate matters to observe. Besides, he would only be gone a fortnight at most, barely long enough to miss him terribly. He departed in early October, promising to return as swiftly as possible, extracting promises that she would write to him daily, expressing guilt about leaving her alone so soon after their marriage. Emmeline stood on the front steps, waving as his carriage disappeared down the long drive, feeling only a mild melancholy at his absence and confident that he would return exactly as promised. He did not return in a fortnight. The first letter from Piers arrived 3 days after his departure, full of apologies and explanations. The business matters were more complicated than anticipated, requiring additional time to resolve. His mother had suffered a nervous complaint and needed his support during her recovery. He would return as soon as humanly possible, certainly within another week at most. Emmeline replied with understanding and love, concealing her disappointment behind cheerful descriptions of her daily activities. She mentioned that she had been feeling somewhat unwell in the mornings, but assured him it was nothing serious, probably just an adjustment to the country air. The second letter arrived a week later, bearing similar excuses and escalating apologies. The legal matters had expanded unexpectedly. His mother's health remained fragile. Parliamentary obligations demanded his attendance. He sent his deepest love and begged her patience, promising faithfully to return by the end of the month. Emmeline's reply was briefer this time, her growing anxiety difficult to conceal. She mentioned more directly that she suspected she might be with child, that she needed to consult with physicians, that his presence would provide comfort during this uncertain time. That letter, like many of those that would follow, never reached its intended recipient. The Dowager Duchess had returned to London not to nurse a nervous complaint, but to begin the most ruthless phase of her campaign. She had installed herself in Keswick House, claimed illness to ensure her son remained nearby, and systematically intercepted every letter that passed between husband and wife. Emmeline's missives, with their growing desperation and mentions of pregnancy, disappeared into the Dowager Duchess's desk drawer, unread by the man for whom they were intended. In their place, she forged replies that became increasingly cold and perfunctory, suggesting that the Duke found London society more engaging than rustic solitude with an inconvenient wife. Meanwhile, she worked upon her son with the skill of a master sculptor shaping clay. She never spoke directly against Emmeline, knowing that overt criticism would provoke his defensive loyalty. Instead, she planted tiny seeds of doubt, dropped casual observations, created situations that required his continued presence. She mentioned hearing rumors about improper behavior at Thornfield, expressed concern about whether Emmeline truly understood her duties as Duchess, suggested that his young wife might benefit from time to mature before taking on the full responsibilities of her position. Most devastatingly, she intercepted letters from Emmeline that mentioned pregnancy, and showed her son only those that spoke of daily trivialities, carefully editing them to remove any urgent need for his return. She explained that young wives often became overly emotional and demanding, that giving Emmeline space to establish her independence would ultimately strengthen their marriage, that his continued absence demonstrated trust rather than neglect. Piers, who had been raised to trust his mother's judgment implicitly, who had never learned to question her motives or doubt her guidance, accepted these manipulations with the credulity of a child. He convinced himself that staying in London served everyone's best interests, that his new wife needed time to adjust to her position without his hovering presence, that his mother's experience in such matters justified following her advice. He did not return at the end of October as promised, nor in November, nor at Christmas. Winter descended upon Thornfield Abbey with bitter cold and heavy snows that isolated the estate from the surrounding countryside. Emmeline, now visibly pregnant and desperately lonely, found herself trapped in a gilded cage with servants who followed orders from an invisible hand in London rather than accepting her authority as mistress of the house. She wrote to Piers daily, her letters progressing from loving patience to confused hurt to barely suppressed panic as her pregnancy advanced and her husband remained absent. She described her symptoms, expressed fear about the approaching birth, begged him to return, or at least to send her to London where she might be near him during this frightening time. She wrote of her isolation, of the servants' subtle insubordination, of her growing suspicion that something was terribly wrong. None of these letters reached their destination. The Dowager Duchess, monitoring the correspondence with obsessive attention, recognized that Emmeline's pregnancy posed a significant threat to her plans. A child, particularly a male heir, would cement the marriage and ensure Emmeline's position regardless of any subsequent attempts to separate the couple. She needed to prevent Piers from learning about the pregnancy until circumstances had progressed beyond his ability to intervene effectively. She forged responses to Emmeline's letters, writing in her son's hand with practiced skill honed through years of signing his correspondence during his minority. These fabricated letters grew increasingly cold, suggesting that the Duke found his wife's neediness tiresome, that he questioned whether she was truly suited to her position, that he required space to reconsider their hasty marriage. They never explicitly rejected her, but maintained enough ambiguity to wound without providing concrete grievance. Emmeline, reading these cruel missives in her lonely chambers, felt her world crumbling around her. She could not comprehend what she had done to deserve such treatment. How the man who had sworn eternal devotion could abandon her so completely. She examined her behavior obsessively, searching for faults that might explain his withdrawal. Had she been too familiar? Not formal enough? Too demanding of his attention? Not grateful enough for his condescension in marrying her? The pregnancy became increasingly difficult as winter deepened. Without proper medical attention, the local physician being elderly and half-blind, while the more competent doctors in Derby remained mysteriously unavailable, she suffered through complications that would have alarmed anyone with medical knowledge. She experienced severe swelling in her extremities, crushing headaches that left her prostrate for days, and alarming pains that suggested her body was not tolerating the pregnancy well. Each symptom was a warning sign that went unheeded, each pain a cry for help that echoed through empty corridors. She wrote frantically to Piers about these symptoms, begging him to send his London physicians or at least to come himself. Her letters grew increasingly desperate, the elegant script deteriorating into scrawls as her hands shook with pain and fear. She pleaded, she reasoned, she wept onto the pages. These letters, like all the others, vanished into the Dowager Duchess's collection, filed away as evidence of the writer's hysterical unsuitability, rather than delivered to their intended recipient. The silence that followed each missive was deafening. By February, Emmeline had stopped writing. She had finally accepted what she believed to be the truth, that her husband regretted their marriage, that he had been manipulated into the match by momentary infatuation, that he now despised her for trapping him with her inferior birth and presumptuous ambitions. The realization broke something fundamental in her spirit, transforming the hopeful young woman who had arrived at Thornfield into a hollow-eyed ghost who haunted the corridors of her prison. The servants, following orders from London conveyed through the steward, maintained the fiction that everything was proceeding normally. They brought meals she could not eat, maintained chambers she barely inhabited, and avoided her desperate attempts at conversation with the efficiency of well-trained automatons. The isolation became so complete that Emmeline began to doubt her own perceptions, wondering if she had imagined her husband's love, if the whole courtship had been a cruel delusion conjured by her desperate desire to escape poverty. Meanwhile, in London, Piers attended parliamentary sessions and social obligations with the dutiful efficiency his mother had always demanded of him. He felt occasionally a twinge of guilt about his prolonged absence from Thornfield, particularly when passing the library where he and Emmeline had spent so many pleasant hours discussing literature. Once, at a political dinner, he mentioned to his mother that perhaps he should return to Derbyshire, that his wife might need his support as she adjusted to her new position. The Dowager Duchess had placed a gentle hand upon his arm and spoken with such maternal wisdom that he felt ashamed of his doubts. She reminded him that young wives required independence to develop confidence in their roles, that his constant presence would make Emmeline reliant upon him rather than capable in her own right. That absence in the early months of marriage often strengthened the eventual bond by allowing each party to grow individually. Her logic seemed impeccable, her concern genuine, and Piers, who had been trained since childhood to trust her judgment, suppressed his instincts and remained in London, whilst his wife wept alone in their country estate. In early March, 7 months into her pregnancy and 3 weeks before her time, Emmeline's body finally surrendered to the accumulated stresses of isolation, inadequate medical care, and crushing despair. The labor began prematurely while she was alone in her chambers, the pains striking with such sudden violence that she barely managed to summon her maid before collapsing. The birth that followed was a nightmare of agony and terror. The elderly local physician arrived hours too late, fumbling with instruments and procedures while Emmeline screamed herself hoarse. The child, a tiny, perfect boy who might have lived with proper medical intervention, arrived stillborn, his miniature face peaceful as though he had simply decided that this cold, unwelcoming world was not worth entering. Emmeline held her dead son for hours, weeping with a grief so profound that it seemed to emanate from the very stones of Thornfield Abbey. She had lost everything: her husband's love, her position, her future, and now she had lost even this small hope of finding purpose in motherhood. The servants, terrified by her complete emotional collapse, finally took initiative and sent an urgent message to London informing the Duke that his heir had been lost and his wife appeared to be dying. That message, sent by express rider through treacherous weather, reached Keswick House within 2 days. Piers received it whilst dressing for a dinner party his mother had arranged with several eligible widows whose company she felt he should cultivate for future reference. He read the stark words, "Her Grace delivered prematurely. The child was lost. The Duchess is gravely ill," and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He turned to his mother, who stood in the doorway of his dressing room, and asked in a voice devoid of emotion why he had not been informed that his wife was with child. The Dowager Duchess, caught completely off guard by the arrival of a message she had not managed to intercept, recovered her composure with admirable speed and expressed shock that Emmeline had hidden such important news. Surely his wife had mentioned the pregnancy in her letters. How very strange that she would conceal such a matter from her husband. Piers, his mind working with sudden terrible clarity, demanded to see Emmeline's letters. All of them. Immediately. His mother attempted prevarication, claiming they were filed away in various locations, suggesting that such matters could wait until after they had dealt with the immediate crisis. But something in her expression, a flash of fear quickly concealed, told Piers everything he needed to know about where the letters had gone and who had intercepted them. He pushed past her without another word, striding to her private sitting room where she maintained a locked desk containing her personal correspondence. He demanded the key. When she refused, he broke the lock with his bare hands, heedless of the splintering wood and the blood that ran from his torn knuckles. Inside, arranged with meticulous organization, he found months of letters from his wife. Letters describing her pregnancy, her illness, her desperate loneliness, her growing conviction that he had abandoned her. He read them all while his mother watched in frozen silence, her carefully constructed deceptions crumbling like sandcastles before an incoming tide. It was not a gradual process of understanding. It was a single blow of clarity, brutal and absolute. As he read his wife's pleas for help, written in the same elegant hand he had so admired, and compared them to the cold fabrications his mother had shown him, the world he had known did not merely crumble. It revealed itself as a complete fraud, built upon her cruelty and his own unforgivable stupidity. With each letter, his breathing grew more labored, his hands trembling not merely with rage, but with a self-recrimination so profound it threatened to crush him entirely. When he finally looked up at the woman who had raised him, who had controlled every aspect of his life, who had just destroyed his marriage and killed his child through deliberate malice, he barely recognized himself in the words he spoke. He ordered her from his house, permanently. She was to quit Keswick House immediately, to take herself to the Dowager property in Kent, to never again presume to interfere in his life or approach his wife. She would receive her jointure as legally required, but nothing more. No visits, no correspondence, no place in his future, or that of any children he might eventually have. She had proven herself unworthy of the trust he had placed in her, and he would never forgive her for what she had done. The Dowager Duchess, faced with the complete collapse of her authority, attempted one final manipulation. She wept, claimed she had acted only from concern for his welfare, insisted that she had been protecting him from an unsuitable match. But Piers, finally seeing his mother clearly for the first time in his life, remained unmoved by her tears. He left her weeping in the ruins of her sitting room and departed for Derbyshire, driving through the night in weather that would have made more sensible men seek shelter. He arrived at Thornfield 36 hours after receiving the message, exhausted and half frozen, to find his wife lying in their chambers like a corpse awaiting burial. Emmeline did not acknowledge Piers's arrival. She lay in the great bed with her eyes open but unseeing, her body having survived the birth, whilst her spirit had fled to some unreachable place where pain could not follow. The physician explained in hushed tones that whilst her physical condition was stabilizing, her mental state gave grave cause for concern. She had not spoken since the child's death, had not wept since the initial hours of grief, had not shown any awareness of her surroundings or any interest in continued existence. Piers approached the bed with the caution of a man approaching a wounded animal, terrified that any sudden movement might cause further damage. He spoke her name softly, reached for her hand, attempted to explain that he had not known, had not meant to abandon her, had been deceived by his mother into believing she neither needed nor wanted his presence. Emmeline turned her head away. That simple gesture, the slight movement of rejection, devastated him more completely than any words could have done. He realized in that moment the true extent of what his cowardice and credulity had cost them both. He had broken the promises he had made in Vauxhall Gardens, had failed to protect her from his family's cruelty, had allowed his mother to destroy the one genuine love he had ever known. Worse still, his absence had killed their child and nearly killed his wife. The following weeks tested his endurance in ways that battlefield commanders and political rivals had never managed. Emmeline remained locked in her terrible silence, neither rejecting nor accepting his presence, existing in some gray realm between life and death. Piers maintained a vigil beside her bed, sleeping in a chair when exhaustion overcame him, reading aloud from books he hoped might reach her through the fog of trauma, speaking endlessly of his love and remorse and desperate hope for forgiveness. He dismissed every servant who had participated in his mother's schemes, replacing them with staff who understood they served their Duchess above all other considerations. He consulted with the finest physicians from London, Edinburgh, and even Paris, seeking any expertise that might restore his wife's shattered spirit. He wrote to Lady Thornbury begging her to come and provide feminine companionship, hoping that a familiar face might succeed where his presence had failed. Lady Thornbury arrived in April, bringing with her the warmth of genuine affection and the tartness of well-earned reproach. She expressed her opinion of Piers's behavior with a frankness that would have shocked more delicate sensibilities, informing him that he had proven himself a fool of the highest order, that his mother's machinations should have been obvious to anyone with half a mind, and that he was fortunate his wife lived to give him opportunity for redemption, because many women would have simply died of grief and spared him the trouble of begging forgiveness. Her presence seemed to penetrate Emmeline's isolation in ways that Piers's desperate devotion could not. She sat beside the bed, sharing gossip from London, reminiscing about their season together, speaking frankly about the Dowager Duchess's cruelty and Piers's stupidity, whilst making it clear that neither excused the harm they had caused. Slowly, painfully, Emmeline began to respond, first with slight nods or shakes of her head, then with single-word answers, finally with hesitant conversation that suggested her mind was returning from whatever dark place it had fled. Yet even as her physical recovery progressed, the emotional damage remained profound. She could not bear to look at Piers without remembering the months of abandonment, could not hear expressions of love without recalling the cruel letters she had believed were his true sentiments, could not contemplate intimacy with a man who had proven himself so utterly untrustworthy. She had lost not merely a child, but her entire sense of safety in the world, her belief that love could protect her from cruelty, her faith that she deserved happiness. Piers accepted her rejection with more grace than he had shown in any previous trial. He moved into separate chambers, maintaining respectful distance whilst remaining available should she need anything. He consulted her on estate matters despite having no legal obligation to do so, gradually transferring genuine authority over household management and tenant relations into her capable hands. He spoke honestly about his mother's manipulations whilst accepting full responsibility for having been manipulated, making no excuses for failures that had proven catastrophic. Months passed. Summer arrived, transforming Thornfield's gardens into riots of color and scent that seemed to mock the emotional winter still gripping the household. Emmeline gradually reclaimed her role as Duchess, discovering that she possessed unexpected talent for estate management and genuine interest in the welfare of tenants whose lives depended upon ducal decisions. She found purpose in improving cottages, establishing schools, and ensuring that laborers received fair treatment. Work that filled hours otherwise devoted to grief and gave her reason to rise each morning despite the emptiness that haunted every private moment. Piers watched her transformation from a distance, taking pride in her accomplishments whilst aching for the intimacy they had lost. He saw her smile occasionally when speaking with tenants' children, observed her animated discussions with the estate steward about agricultural improvements, noticed that she had begun to sing again whilst arranging flowers in the morning room. Each small sign of recovery simultaneously delighted and devastated him, proving that she could build a life without him whilst reminding him of everything his cowardice had destroyed. It was Lady Thornbury who finally forced confrontation, remaining at Thornfield through the summer months and growing increasingly impatient with the elaborate dance of avoidance she observed. In late August, she cornered Emmeline in the library and spoke with the bluntness that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. She informed her protégé that whilst Piers deserved every moment of suffering he currently endured, perpetual punishment served no useful purpose. He had been a fool, yes, but not a villain. He had allowed himself to be manipulated by a master of manipulation, had failed through weakness rather than malice, and had spent every moment since discovering the truth attempting to make amends. The question was whether Emmeline intended to spend the rest of her life punishing him for sins he genuinely regretted, or whether she might find it within herself to consider the possibility of forgiveness. Emmeline's response was not what Lady Thornbury expected. She did not defend her continued coldness or insist upon her right to withhold forgiveness. Instead, she wept for the first time since her son's death, great wrenching sobs that seemed to tear themselves from some deep well of accumulated pain. She confessed that she did not know how to forgive him, that every time she looked at Piers, she saw the empty cradle in the nursery, that she feared allowing herself to love again, only to be abandoned once more when she proved inadequate to her position. Lady Thornbury held her while she wept, offering no false comfort, but speaking with the honesty that genuine affection permitted. She acknowledged that some injuries cut too deep for easy healing, that trust once broken required years to rebuild, that Emmeline's fears were entirely rational given what she had endured. Yet she also pointed out that Emmeline still loved her husband despite everything, that love persisted even through devastating betrayal, and that perhaps the question was not whether to forgive, but whether to give love another chance to prove itself stronger than fear. The conversation planted seeds that required weeks to germinate. Emmeline began to observe Piers more carefully, noticing things she had previously ignored in her determination to maintain emotional distance. She saw how he advocated for tenants during disputes with neighboring landowners, prioritizing their welfare over profit. She observed his patience with elderly retainers whose inefficiency would have driven other masters to dismissal. She overheard him speaking to the new housekeeper about ensuring the Duchess's comfort above all other considerations, his voice rough with emotion as he emphasized that his wife had suffered enough through his failures and deserved every possible care. She began to remember, too, the man she had fallen in love with in those golden weeks before their marriage, his intelligence, his dry humor, his unexpected gentleness. That man had not been a fiction, had not vanished merely because circumstances had revealed his weaknesses. He was still there, humbled and chastened, demonstrating through actions rather than words his commitment to becoming worthy of her trust. It was a seemingly small incident in early September that finally cracked the shell of ice surrounding Emmeline's heart. One of the oldest tenant farmers, a man who had served the estate for more than 40 years, made a catastrophic error in judgment that resulted in the loss of an entire wheat harvest from one of the most productive fields. The financial loss was substantial enough to ruin the man and his family. Emmeline, working in the morning room on estate correspondence, overheard Piers discussing the matter with his steward through the open door of the library. She expected, given the pressures of managing the duchy and the legitimate anger such negligence might provoke, to hear her husband demand recompense or dismissal. Instead, she heard Piers dismiss the entire debt with a single sentence delivered in a tone that brooked no argument. He informed the steward that the man had served his father faithfully for 4 decades, that loyalty of such duration was worth more than any quantity of grain, and that the loss would be absorbed by the estate without consequence to the farmer or his family. It was the observation of this unexpected grace, this capacity for forgiveness and mercy that he had not possessed when standing before his mother's manipulations, that convinced Emmeline her husband was truly becoming the man she needed rather than merely performing contrition. A man who could extend such generous pardon to a servant might perhaps deserve the chance to earn her own forgiveness. In September, 1 year after Piers had departed for London and set in motion the catastrophe that had destroyed their happiness, Emmeline made a decision. She would not, could not, simply forgive and forget, could not pretend that the past months had not occurred or that the damage could be easily repaired. But she could acknowledge that she wanted to try, that the alternative, spending the rest of her life locked in grief and anger, held no appeal, that perhaps love deserved another chance even if trust required years to rebuild. She sought him out in his study, where he spent most evenings poring over estate ledgers and correspondence. He looked up at her entrance with an expression of such naked hope that she nearly lost her courage. But she forced herself to speak the words she had rehearsed 100 times, telling him that whilst she could not promise immediate forgiveness, she was willing to attempt reconciliation. She proposed that they begin again, as strangers learning to know each other, building trust gradually through demonstrated commitment rather than passionate declarations. Piers accepted these terms with a gratitude that would have been humiliating had it not been so clearly sincere. He promised to earn back her trust day by day, to prove through actions that he had learned from his catastrophic failures, to never again prioritize anyone's wishes or comfort above her own. The rebuilding proceeded slowly, painfully, with setbacks and silences that tested them both. They began taking walks together through the estate, discussing matters of business and gradually progressing to more personal conversations. They shared meals, first in formal silence and eventually with hesitant exchanges that reminded them both of earlier intimacy. They read aloud to each other in the evenings, finding in literature a safe space where emotions could be explored through fictional proxies rather than dangerous personal revelations. Emmeline discovered that Piers had indeed changed, that his mother's exile had freed him to become the man he might have been, had he not been raised under her suffocating control. He learned to recognize manipulation, to question authority, to prioritize his wife's welfare above all competing demands. He proved, through countless small acts of consideration and larger demonstrations of loyalty, that his devotion was real and enduring. Months became years. The trust that had been shattered so completely began to knit itself back together, scarred and imperfect, but genuine. In the spring of 1818, 3 years after their disastrous wedding, Emmeline realized that she had fallen in love with her husband again, or perhaps that she had never truly stopped loving him despite everything. This love was different from the passionate infatuation of their courtship, tempered by experience and loss. But it was also deeper, more resilient, rooted in genuine knowledge rather than romantic fantasy. She went to his chambers late one evening, entering without knocking for the first time since her recovery. Piers looked up from his book with surprise that transformed to wonder as she approached the bed. She told him simply that she was ready, that she had forgiven him as much as anyone could forgive such injuries, that she wanted to truly be his wife rather than merely sharing his name and home. Their reunion was tender rather than passionate, marked by tears and whispered reassurances as they rediscovered the physical intimacy that had been lost along with so much else. It was, in its own way, more meaningful than their wedding night had been. A conscious choice to trust again, rather than the inevitable culmination of romantic courtship. In the autumn of 1819, Emmeline delivered a healthy daughter they named Grace, a word that encompassed forgiveness, divine favor, and the elegant movement through which they had learned to navigate their complicated love. The child's arrival did not erase the pain of their lost son, but it suggested that life could continue despite tragedy, that hope could be reborn even from devastating loss. The Dowager Duchess, confined to her dower property in Kent and forbidden all contact with her son, learned of the birth through the newspapers. She spent her remaining years, she would die in 1822 of influenza, in bitter isolation, attended by servants who pitied or feared her but never loved her, contemplating the empire she had lost through her refusal to relinquish control. Piers and Emmeline never spoke of her after her exile. She became, in their shared history, merely a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing others to control one's life and choices. They focused instead on building a marriage that, whilst bearing scars of its near destruction, had proven itself capable of surviving even the cruelest tests. And so, another tale of hearts tested by cruelty reaches its conclusion, not with the simple happiness of fairy stories, but with the complicated redemption of genuine human experience. Love, it seems, can survive even devastating betrayal, though never without cost. The wounds remain, the trust must be rebuilt brick by painful brick, and forgiveness comes slowly if it comes at all. Yet for those with courage to attempt such reconstruction, there exists the possibility of building something stronger from the ruins. A love that knows its own fragility and values itself accordingly, that guards against complacency, and that never again takes for granted the precious gift of mutual devotion. Emmeline and Piers lived together at Thornfield for another 40 years, raising their daughter and eventually 3 more children, managing their estates with wisdom and compassion, and becoming known throughout Derbyshire for their generosity to tenants and their obvious devotion to each other. Those who knew them in their later years never suspected the anguish that had nearly destroyed their union, seeing only a couple whose love had been tested by time and found enduring. But sometimes, on winter evenings when snow fell softly outside their windows, Emmeline would grow quiet and distant, remembering the season she had spent weeping alone, carrying a child who would never be born into a world that would welcome him. And Piers, observing her silence, would draw her close and hold her until the memory passed, offering without words the comfort that had come too late once but would never fail again. For this, dear listeners, is the nature of the deepest wounds. They never disappear completely. They become part of who we are, a map of where we have been and the battles we have survived. The love of Piers and Emmeline was not a tale of perfection, but of reconstruction. And perhaps the strongest love is not that which never breaks, but that which, once shattered, has the courage to be remade, piece by painstaking piece, into something new, wiser, and infinitely more precious than the innocent passion that came before.